Hi there, I'm Joey from EDHREC, and last year I tracked every game of Commander that I played. I played a total of 217 games in 2023, and a little bit ago we released a full video going over the biggest results of that data. We went over which decks won and lost the most, the overall win percentage, what was the effect of fast mana on turn 1, what was the average length of games, things like that. And that was a super fun episode to do, but there were some extra data that we didn't really have the time to dig into in that episode. So that's what this video is. I wanted to follow up on a couple of things, dig a little bit deeper into some of the numbers, hopefully clarify any questions that people may have had, and give any helpful tips if you yourself wanted to try logging your games this year. So let's dig in. Let's start off with game length. In my 2023 data, I noted that the average game lasted approximately 9.4 turns. I also noted that the average first KO in a game was on turn 8.1. And that's interesting as a bird's eye view. I'll also mention something at the end of the video about how this figure was measured, but for now, let's get more granular with this figure. This here is a chart where the game length is averaged out not just as a whole, but per deck, tracking how many times I played that deck, how often it won, how long its games were, and what turn that deck typically witnessed the first KO. We showed some of these results in our original data recap video, but I wanted to go a step further and measure these figures out also based on the games that they won versus the games that they lost, which are the two far right columns there. For many of these decks, there's not a big difference, but some decks did have a difference, and that could perhaps clue me into that deck's strengths or weaknesses. For example, there's a slight difference in my Mimeoplasm deck. Games it lost were on average a turn longer than games it won. This is also true for my themed Tana Timna deck a couple of rows down, so perhaps that's a sign that these decks lose steam in the late game, or may struggle a little more against decks with more control-y or long-term strategies. Looks like this is also the case for my Rayhan Ishai deck, which it turned out could win faster than my usual average, as well as for my Wilhelt deck, where the games that it lost were a full 2 turns slower on average than the games that it won. So while I'm playing these decks and assessing who's my biggest threat, perhaps I can keep in mind to be aware of which enemy decks are likely to outpace me if the games were to become a more prolonged siege. By contrast, when I borrowed someone else's deck, the games that I lost were on turn 8-ish, while the games that I won were up to like turn 11. The longer games favored me when I played someone else's deck. Maybe that speaks to the speed at which I was able to discover and get comfortable with that deck synergies and find out how it ticks. We see too that my Conrad and Yannette decks also favored longer games over shorter games. Conrad in particular usually won games on turn 9, but games that I lost with it were often over on turn 7. I read this as the deck having a weakness against faster decks like combo, burn, and aggro, and it perhaps indicates that I need to focus on faster setup in the early turns with that deck. Or perhaps I need to be more careful with how much life that deck pays to activate abilities and cast spells, since keen opponents may have punished my life total when I was using it as a resource. And finally, also noteworthy when it comes to game speed is Karazakar, who won games more often on turn 11 compared to losing games more often around turn 8. This one is especially ironic, because the goad strategy obviously speeds games up. The overall average game length for this deck is almost a full turn shorter than my overall average game length of 9.4 turns. However, my Karazakar deck clearly prefers when the games go long, so that I have time to actually use all those cards I drew. So that's a tough balance that I have to keep in mind with that deck. The goad will definitely speed things up, but I can't have it speed up too quickly that it just enables my opponents to take off with their decks before I'm able to take off with mine. Now, it's important to note that the sample sizes here are tiny. I played some decks 20 or 30 times, but some others only like 7 or 8. Some decks that I didn't mention much yet, I only played like 1 time, so there's nothing really notable about their data there. And even with some of the decks that I did mention just now, when you look at how many games they won or that they lost, we're only talking about it won 2 games and it lost 6 games. There's a tiny sample size here, a tiny number of games leading to some of these averages, which is why it's not wise to read too heavily into these. We don't have a solid enough foundation here for big takeaways. I look forward to getting more data in 2024, but for the most part, I'm viewing these as some interesting figures that might clue me into some things to pay attention to, but they're by no means something that demands drastic action or that I make big changes. This whole exercise is just for fun. Alright, that was a fun one, but now how about colors? I tracked to see how often each color appeared amongst the decks that won in my games in 2023. Total, I saw decks including white win 100 times, decks including blue win 93 times, black 122 times, red 84 times, and green 107 times. And I saw 4 colorless deck wins. That's just the raw number of colors though. How about specific color combinations? In that case, Golgari decks won 20 times, Orzhov 18, and Gruul 15. And a full list follows after that, but I'm not going to read every single one of them. However, I think it's safe to say there's a hefty amount of bias here. I'm tracking my own games, and almost all of my decks contain black. I kinda have a type, and my win percentage was slightly higher than the expected average of 25% in a 4-player pod, which means I'm skewing the data in a lot of ways here. Heck, just look at the number of times that blueless decks won in my data. That's purely from my Tana Tymna deck. In other words, this doesn't tell us much yet, and it doesn't tell me, for example, what things to watch for out there from my opponent's decks. So I ran these figures again, removing any data where I won that game to see which colors won against me the most often, because that might be useful for me to see what I'm weak against. In that case, I saw decks including white win 67 times, blue 66 times, black down to 61 times, and red and green were at the top with 70 and 71 respectively. And when counting only opponent color combinations that won the game, we see the decks that beat me most often were Gruul, Azorius, and rainbow or 5-color decks. I think it's safe to say that when I was including my own data, I was definitely overrepresenting some Golgari numbers. It's possible, however, that I only lost against those color combinations because I played against a lot of those color combinations in general. Those color combos might just be the most winning because they're the most popular and therefore the most likely to appear in game pods. You know, if Gruul won 14 games, but I encountered Gruul decks like 200 times, that would be a pretty bad win percentage. Whereas if Azorius decks won 10 times and I only encountered like 11 total Azorius decks out there, well, that would be a huge win percentage. That would be a big deal. We need to know some proportions here. So let's expand out even further. On the right here, we have a column showing how popular each color combination is right now according to EDHREC data, where we can see that, for instance, 5-color or rainbow decks are at the top of the heap, and Gruul decks are about mid-popularity. But just because that's how it is in general doesn't mean that was reflected in the games that I played. My own playgroup or meta might bias the kinds of decks or color combos that I play against, for example. So here's yet another column detailing how many times I played against each guild or color combination. Some combos fall in line with the expectation. For instance, 5-color decks are very popular, and I indeed played against them the most often. And Golgari and Izzet decks were about as popular and common for me to encounter as one would expect. But for some color combos, that wasn't the case. So now I'd like to measure up the proportion of how often those color combos won by using the data from that left column, which gives us these win percentages from the color combinations that I played against. This way we'll get to see not just how common it was that I encountered these color combos, but if there were any that won a lot or won very little, given how often they showed up. Long journey to get here, but I appreciate you bearing with me. Some overall takeaways from this. I saw Gruul, Azorius, and Selesnya decks a bit more often than you would typically expect, given how popular they are in EDH in general. But I didn't encounter very many Grixis or mono-black or mono-red decks, despite how popular those types of decks tend to be. Focusing in on some percentages, Gruul's win percentage is in fact higher than the expected average, so it turns out I should be mindful of that. In the games that I played, Gruul won more than the average 25% of the time. It won a full third of its games. So not only did I see Gruul more often, but it also won more often too. I also take note of a similar 1/3 win percentage for the mono blue decks and the Jund decks that I played against too. Maybe it would be worth it for me to look over the various Gruul, Jund, and mono blue lists that I played against to see if they had any things in common that might be weaknesses against my usual playstyle. Notably, farther down on these columns, the number of total games gets very, very low, so it's hard to read into anything too seriously here, but I will note that that colorless deck figure, that's a great win percentage. They won 4 of the 6 games that I saw last year, so watch out for those. On the flip side, color combinations like Dimir I didn't play against very often, despite their popularity, but when I did see them, I guess I or the rest of the table all did really well against them. I won a lot of games last year with Dimir decks, but Dimir decks didn't win a lot of games against me or against the pods that I was involved in. Looking over my game data, I actually know that the wins tracked here were from my family's Initiative deck, which won a good average number of its games, so that's no big culprit here. But I did also see that the most common Dimir decks I played against included Captain Nagathrod, Wilhelt, and the new fairies last year. And I wonder if the reason that I did well against those types of decks is because maybe they accidentally helped out my usual graveyard shenanigans. Me with all my necromancy meant that maybe I was actually able to use some of their own tricks against them. And maybe that's why I was able to do pretty well against Dimir last year. Moving to some of those other low win percentages, I was also pretty proficient against Rakdos decks, Naya decks, and as it turns out, those 5-color decks too. They also all had lower win percentages. I'm not sure yet if there's a connecting thread on any of those. It seems like a pretty far spread, but it's definitely interesting. Of course, this doesn't mean that I can just take it easy against like a 5-color opponent or anything, or that I should always attack the Gruul player because I am usually weak against Gruul or what have you. These are just some interesting patterns, but in any game, any color combo can swoop in with super impressive wins. You gotta play the game that's actually in front of you. That's way more important than any of these numbers. Alright, now we're on to the biggest and thorniest one, fast mana. In my gameplay data, I found that when someone played turn 1 fast mana, like a Sol Ring, Mana Crypt, or Jeweled Lotus, that player won that game 45% of the time. In our original data reveal episode, I stated a frankly comical number of times to please not take this as gospel. I am but one man and my results do not reflect a universal experience. I'll say more about the fast mana impacting a player's win percentage thing in a moment, but the first thing that I want to do is go one step beyond this figure. Ignoring win percentage for a moment, according to my data, did the presence of early fast mana have an effect on the overall speed of the game? My games averaged 9.4 turns, but what was the average game length when turn 1 fast mana was present? Well, turns out the average game length for games that started off with turn 1 fast mana was 8.3 turns, a full 1.1 below the average. But that's just the length of games where fast mana was present at all, regardless of who won that game. What if we only count the games where the person with the fast mana won? In that case, the average goes to 8.1 turns. So, okay, interesting. I did play some games where there was turn 1 fast mana and then the game went to like round 13, but that was certainly atypical. Fast mana seems well named, and I think this result probably doesn't surprise anyone, but it's interesting to actually see the numbers bear things out. Now, there are a couple things we mentioned in the original video and which bear repeating here. The first thing is sample size. I played 217 games, which isn't a huge population, and only 37 of those games contained turn 1 fast mana. That's a hilariously small sample size. Now, I feel pretty safe in assuming that game speed is in fact impacted by fast mana. I'd make that claim without any numbers at all. It's literally called fast mana. But 37 games is not a lot to draw from in a game that has as many complex variables as Commander. Which brings me to thing 2, that win percentage figure. 5 years ago, the Command Zone did a show measuring a lot of game data too, and they also measured things like the influence of early fast mana. So a quick refresher. When Command Zone did their measurements, they had roughly 90 games that contained early fast mana, and they found a win percentage of 21.6%, slightly below the average expectation of 25 win percentage in a 4-player game, which went against the common expectation that early fast mana would improve your win percentage. And they postulated that perhaps early fast mana draws more attention to that player, a little bit of an archenemy situation, which is harder to fend off, and mayhaps that impacts the win percentage. Obviously, my result is different than theirs, and this is why I kept repeating, and will keep repeating, to please view responsibly. Because I knew people would, and then I saw a bunch of people did chime in with wild hypotheses about our different results. So I want to try my best to make sure we don't get the wrong takeaways here. So first of all, there's a significant time gap between these measurements. The landscape of Commander has changed a lot in the last 5 years. And second of all, Command Zone was tracking Sol Ring and Mana Crypt on turns 1 through 3, versus me tracking only on turn 1. I also counted Jeweled Lotus in this figure, which didn't exist at the time that Command Zone did their episode. We're genuinely not even tracking the same data. Maybe it's not quite comparing apples to oranges, but we're at least comparing like Fuji apples to Granny Smiths. They are so different. The primary thing I want to express here is that with a small sample size, just playing another couple of games could wildly swing the data in a completely different direction. I don't want to do p-value calculations in front of you because I don't want to bore you to death. Come for the magic cards, like, comment, and subscribe for the college lecture about probability metrics. Probably isn't going to fly, but to try and shorthand it, there's always a chance that you obtain the result fast mana improves your win percentage, even in a world where on average, actually, it might have a negative impact on your win percentage, or it might have a negligible impact on your win percentage, or vice versa. You can't just rely upon finding one result. Sometimes you also have to show how likely or unlikely it would be to get a different result when you're doing those measurements. Proving things sometimes means you also have to actually disprove their opposites. But with only 37 fast mana games, I do not have a sample size big enough to help me disprove a null hypothesis. No one does. And even if these were just one-on-one games, a population size of just 37 is way too small to make any definite call. I find myself agreeing strongly with this commenter. The number of games you would need in a place like Commander, a multiplayer format where you have so many different variables all acting upon each other, would need to be in the literal thousands. But of course, I don't have that ability. I'm just one dude who tracked his games for fun and who thought that you might enjoy seeing some of the results. And I'm just trying to be clear about what they actually mean. And of course, at some point, you've just got to work with what you've got. There's no way I can measure thousands of games. All you have to do in those cases, though, is just make sure that you're very responsible with what those results mean and with what they don't mean. And that's why I keep saying, please don't take this as gospel. And that's something that the Command Zone, as well as their statistician Adam Green, made very clear as well. Averages don't tell you how to play a game. Statistics mean nothing to the individual, and becoming dogmatic about any of these figures would make you a worse player. You've got to play the game that's in front of you, not the game that you think the numbers say should happen. If you'd like to interpret these different results as, well, maybe fast mana used to negatively impact your win percentage, but the game has sped up over the past 5 years, so maybe now early fast mana has a bigger positive impact, then okay. I could imagine that being the case. If you'd like to interpret these different results as, well, one of them was measuring game videos online, whereas the other was measuring the experience of just a single player, plus they were measuring different turns, like turn 1 versus turns 1 through 3, so they're really not even comparable, then yeah, that's very true. Those are very different data sets with very different biases. For example, game videos posted online could have a selection bias for which ones got edited and published, whereas the games that I played in would have a bias towards, for example, how many black decks that I play, or have a bias in the type of opponents that I face more regularly. So very different data sets. It's, again, a Fuji and Granny Smith Apple situation. If you'd like to interpret these results as one of us is wrong, then okay, that's possible too. I'm the one with fewer games, so maybe it's me. And if you'd like to interpret the results as these are irrelevant because the sample size is minuscule compared to what you'd actually need to discover anything truly actionable, then sure. I hope it's still fun to go over them, though. I mean, I'm certainly having fun making this video. And regardless of any numbers, if the advice is good, then the advice is good. The Command Zone's ultimate point was to advocate that you be wise about when you deploy scary-looking cards to avoid drawing too much attention to yourself. Independent of any stats, that's just a good recommendation. So kindly don't be weird about this, I guess. I've honestly been a little nervous about mentioning these direct comparisons to the Command Zone stats video, because even in our original episode, where I just said my findings and I said, please don't take this as gospel a huge number of times, and I didn't mention any other channels at all, that still somehow prompted a bunch of wild gooses out there to try and spin those contrasting findings into drama, because the internet loves to conflate and to conflagrate, I guess. It's beyond ludicrous, and y'all just look a little foolish when you try it, so please don't be weird. Don't use any of the data to make sweeping statements about things, and please don't assume that the data means something that it doesn't mean. I am, again, one guy doing a funny video that I think is fun, but these results do not reflect a universal experience, not by any means. Alright, now here's a tricky one. How about the effects of deck price? I went and sorted my decks by win percentage and also logged their price, shown here, to see if there's a strong correlation between a deck's price tag and how much it wins. As we see, I had some spendier decks with good win percentages, but I also almost never played them. Their sample size is quite tiny. Whereas two of the decks I played the most last year were Barakos and my themed Timnatana deck, which are amongst the cheapest decks that I've got, and they've got great win percentages. Barakos won 38% of those games. And of course, I've got some expensive decks near the bottom of the list here too. Like, two of my most expensive decks had performances that were super mid-tier. Also, perhaps most importantly, we don't know the budgets of the decks that I played against. I mean, last time I checked, when EDHREC did a deep data dive on prices, the average Commander deck price was $485. But also, prices shift around all the time too. We also don't know the price of the decks that I borrowed, where I had a really high win percentage. My point is, the decks that I played may have played against cheaper decks, or more expensive decks, or very likely both at the same time. So it's hard to look at these figures and say, yes, price definitely had X effect or Y effect for sure. Because even when I played a spendier deck, the decks at the rest of the table might have been at that same price, or maybe they were even higher prices, you know? I know whenever I pulled up my Titania deck, for instance, that I was always playing against some really souped up enemy lists. Point being, these figures don't contain a lot of information. I'll actually go ahead and say that I've seen some rhetoric online from people trying to use deck price as an indicator of power level, and I just want to say that that feels like a big step backward to me. Good cards are good, for sure, and good cards often get a huge price tag too, but expensive decks can lose, and budget decks win plenty. I guess it's also worth me briefly mentioning that I obviously don't build my own decks on a strict budget super often, and also some of these prices are affected by, like, foils or premium versions that I splurged on, even though the original printing of the card was like less than $2 or what have you. My Mimeoplasm deck's price is obscene, for instance, but it's my oldest deck. I've had it for more than a decade now, so it's got some indulgences in it. Like, straight up 3/4 of that deck's price tag is just because over the years I got 2 of the OG dual lands in that deck. Honestly, a lot of the price of each of these decks is just because of the mana base. If you wanted to cut down the price of any of these lists, just changing out like 5 lands would cut their prices in half. I'm not even kidding. Mana bases are crazy in this game, y'all. But anyway, yeah, I know lots of players may stick to the $100 to $150 range for some of their decks, so it's possible that some of these numbers feel unrelatable, but I just don't want to give the impression that price is what leads to wins. I helped my cousin build a $50 Omnath deck last year, and I think she's won every single game she's played against me with that thing. And my ex got back into Magic recently, and he's got a super cheap Lae'zel Master Chef deck, and it's hilariously good. And don't underestimate how powerful precons are either, which are of course usually like $40 to $50 to purchase, but are often worth like $100 total or whatever, and they're just excellent. Wizards has gotten really good at making precons. And of course, if your playgroup likes to proxy, then hell yeah, power to you. Playing within your means and having fun is more important than any of the numbers currently on screen. I honestly care the most that the decks that I played the most were some of my cheapest decks, and the decks that I didn't play much at all were some of the spendier ones. That's the figure that I find the biggest wake-up call here. If I'm optimizing those decks, but then I'm not playing them all that much, that's truly the most important takeaway for me. And maybe that's something that will encourage me to reconsider how those decks are built. All right, those were some big extra things that were kind of easier to see, easier to show on screen and stuff like that. But for this last section of the video, I want to get into some extra things that are much muddier. For instance, another figure that I tracked and that we announced on our original episode were the ways that games ended, such as when games ended due to combat damage, or if they ended as a result of life loss/burn, or mill, or commander damage, things like that. And just like we did here in this episode when we were comparing the representation of color combinations and how often they won, some folks pointed out in our original episode that a more useful figure might be how often those win conditions won compared to how often they were represented in games. So for example, in 2023, I saw 0 games end due to mill, but if I played against 0 mill decks at all in 2023, then that wouldn't really be a meaningful figure that tells us anything about mill, now would it? Whereas I also saw 10 games win due to commander damage in 2023, and if I only played against 10 Voltron decks that were trying to win with commander damage in 2023, then that would be pretty noteworthy, now wouldn't it? The problem, of course, the reason that this is in the muddy section, is that I can't speak to everyone's intentions with their decks. Plenty of people might present a deck that looks like one thing, but it performs in a completely different way. A Phoenix player might look like a mill deck, but maybe it's actually self-mill to dig down to a combo. Or if you encounter a Vishgraz, is that deck Aristocrats? Is it Poison? Is it Voltron? Is it combo? Because I've seen it win in every single one of those ways. If you encounter a Captain Nagathrod, is that a mill deck, or is it just a bunch of horrors that are smashing face and stealing things? Landfall decks can win famously with a bunch of tokens and with a bunch of direct damage. And there could always be secret surprise combos in just about any deck. We all have backup win cons. If I were to label other people's decks and assume that I know 100% of their deck's intentions, I'd absolutely produce biased results. Even if I ask them, I might be missing a whole lot of details about the way that their deck works, and so I just don't want to rely upon judgment calls like that. So really, I'm okay just figuring out, on average, how did a game end? Because that, to me, actually gives me the best impression about, for example, how much should I value cards like Fogs in my own decks due to how often I see combat damage being a relevant way that games end. The answer is probably a lot, because it turns out a lot of the games that I saw in 2023 ended due to just good old-fashioned combat damage. Check out the original video if you want to see the full figure. It's really interesting. It's really cool. Check it out. Link in the description. All right, here's another big muddy one. People asking if the decks that I played changed over the course of 2023. Because after all, if you changed the 99 of your decks a lot, then doesn't that kind of make them a different deck? So you're changing the variables, and doesn't that affect the results? The answer here is yes. I tinkered with my decks during 2023. I'm not a lab tech doing a carefully controlled, peer-reviewed experiment where every variable must be very carefully tracked. I am a layman. I'm a regular dude, and I didn't, for the sake of this silly data tracking project that I'm doing for my own amusement and enjoyment, I didn't keep my deck lists exactly frozen the same in amber for 365 full days. I don't know how many cards you can change from a deck before it becomes a different deck. I don't know how many grains of sand you can remove from a beach before it becomes a different beach. I imagine people will draw those lines in very, very different places. This is a real Ship of Theseus situation when it comes to these deck lists. All I can say is that I believe they maintained their same spirit over the course of 2023, and that I enjoy experimenting with new cards when they come out, because why wouldn't I? Moving right on, I hinted at this at the start of the video, but I want to be upfront here about the fact that the ways that I track some of the data definitely has some inherent skews to it. So I guess maybe this can be kind of a tip for anyone out there who's tracking similar things that I am. For example, I tracked game length by putting a die on top of my library and ticking it up on my turn, because it was the easiest way for me to remember that, which means I only tracked rounds at the start of my own turn, not at the start of each round whenever it got back to the first player's turn. I didn't go first every round, so that warps things. It's also possible that using a median instead of a mean average would be a preferable way of measuring game length, since then you actually get a whole number. But, I mean, at the same time, games end mid-round all the time. Someone winning on their turn 8 while someone else only got 7 turns is a thing that we really have to factor in here. So given both those factors, I was inclined to still use the mean average, but just in general round the numbers down. But just in case you're curious, the median game end was turn 9, and the median first KO was turn 8. And it's worth stating outright that this was not the most efficient or correct way to collect data. It's just one of those things where I'm up against the practical limitations of the real world, you know? My technique for tracking turns was developed as a way to be as unobtrusive as possible to the rest of the players, just ticking it up when it's on or by my own library instead of having to slow everything down and count things all of the time. I got a lot of questions about that. People asking, how did you log these games without slowing down other players and being disruptive to their games? And that was one of the ways how. I mean, just working up the habit of keeping track of my own turn count, that was already hard enough. But like, I do believe that if I were to have tried to keep track of turn count by tracking the first player, taking it up during another person's turn, I think it would have caused me to mess up a whole bunch, and I'd have a lot of incorrect numbers in my data just from missing things, because it's already hard enough to keep track of all 20 triggered abilities that might be on a board at any given time, you know? So yeah, just that's worth stating. If you track your games, consider how you'd establish that habit, because I already have trouble remembering my own triggered abilities during other people's turns, you know? So adding an extra thing on top of that, it's pretty tricky. But also consider this. What would you count as a game ending on turn 8? Like, if the player who went first wins on their turn 8, but everyone else only got 7 turns, would you log that as it ending on round 8 or on round 7? Would you wait until the full round is completed, or would you count the beginning of a fresh round? The way that you measure will skew things, and that's why I want to apply this data as a relative thing for me to consider my decks in relation to each other, rather than stating outright things about the status of the format. Plus, tracking doesn't come at the expense of other people's time and enjoyment. I've got my notebook here that I jotted all my notes in, and I logged my games, and then I transferred them into a spreadsheet later. But like, I tried to choose my moments about when I would do that because I don't want to slow other people down. I tried to just do it like before and after the game, or if I was fully tapped out and it was someone else's turn, then I might jot a note down or two. But I don't want to cause other people to wait on me because I'm in a game to be present with other players. So the data is interesting, but it doesn't come before other people. Honestly, that's kind of my final answer to any lingering questions that people may have about why didn't you track X, or I think you should log Y, and why don't you know other people's deck intentions, or why did your decks change a bit over the years, and why didn't you track how often the other players won in the turn order that they won, and all of that, because ultimately, I'm just doing what I can, y'all. There might be some extra things that I do try to add in as I'm logging more information, more games as I continue the project in 2024, but there's only so much that I can do. I've got some practical reality limitations. And if any of that data tracking eventually ends up straining against the fun of the game, then I don't think I'm going to be able to keep that as a habit because it would ruin my relationship to Magic. So that might be something that I'm not able to track because I'm just a regular human guy doing his darndest. All right, here's another muddy one. A lot of folks asked about a fun metric, not just tracking how often games won, but whether their games were enjoyable. To me, honestly, the number of times that I play each deck already kind of answers that. Like, I reach more often for the things that I enjoy the most. But it is an interesting idea. I just don't have a clean answer for that. But more than that, I think that this type of question is actually a place where I can briefly touch on another related thing, the relationship between fun and win percentage. Because that's something that we touched on a lot in the original episode, but which I saw a lot of wild different takes and different responses to, so I guess I just want to try and explain my stance on it really quickly here. For instance, one of the things that I said in our original episode is that I don't care who wins so much as whether I care if you had a good time, which prompted some different responses like, well, then what's the point if you don't care about winning? This is a game that has a winner, so if you don't care, what's even the point? So let's engage with that. First of all, the point is just that tracking games was and is pretty fun. I find the practice really fascinating, and I hope that you enjoy the result. And second, those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can totally win 2% of your games and still have had an absolute blast. Just outright, that's why I play Commander. Some of the games that I play are kick back and relax kind of games, and then some other games that I play are very cutthroat. I enjoy both relaxed and pedal to the metal types of gameplay. They're both really fun. But if you're paying more attention to your win percentage rather than how much fun you're having with the deck, I think potentially that could lead you down the wrong path, and it might cause you to make changes to your deck that maybe you don't actually need to make. And if you have a less than average win percentage, I don't think that your takeaway should be that you're a bad Magic player either. My primary goal in tracking my games was to make sure that none of my decks are like punching too hard, that I'm not like accidentally misrepresenting the power level of those decks and playing them in pods that are not equipped to deal with the experience that those decks provide. My Vohar deck, for example, won 45% of its games. That's more than I would have guessed. The numbers tracking that data helped me identify something that I did not notice just from the vibes of playing that deck. So that's potentially a signal to me to be more selective about the pods in which I play that deck. Winning a lot obviously doesn't inherently mean that you're punching down on the rest of the pod, of course. But if I want to give Vohar a challenge, then the data showed me that I could stand to be a little choosier about when I grab it out of my bag. Meanwhile, my Titania deck won all 3 of the games that I played with her last year, and I'm comfortable with her numbers, because I know how powerful that deck is based on vibes, but also I know that the pods that I played her in were prepared for the experience that she provides. We wanted a cutthroat game. So I'm proud of her for her numbers, and I don't feel like that represents her punching down on those pods, because we were all going pedal to the metal in those games. Or there's my Tana Timna Commander deck, which has a very silly theme restriction, but which surprised me by being like bang on average with my regular win percentage. And I would not have guessed that. I would have guessed at the start of the year that that deck would barely win at all. So clearly that deck has legs, which is fun to see, and it encourages me to probably play it more, because it's obviously not something that I only need to reserve for pods where everyone is playing a janky theme restriction. And low win percentages can clue you into something that isn't even necessarily related to deck power. For instance, my Karaza Razakar deck and my Virtus deck, I think that they're pretty well built. I'm actually very pleased with them, but they had low win percentages during the course of 2023. And I think that that can inform us about like the social dynamic that those commanders invite upon the rest of the table. They look like they're broadcasting really big, bombastic, powerful synergies. And there's something to be learned about the attention that you draw to yourself during a game when you have commanders that have those types of social effects. Measuring these things isn't just about yourself. Sometimes it's also a way to find out other people's reactions to the stuff that you play. And of course, measuring this data also made me realize that there were some decks I was playing way more than I thought I was, and some decks that I thought I played a lot that it turns out I barely touched at all. So for folks wondering what's the point, I guess all of that is the point. If I don't have fun with a deck, I don't end up playing it, and I am indeed going to end up taking apart a lot of the decks that I basically never touched throughout all of 2023. Keeping an eye on how often I actually reach for a deck and whether that deck is actually more powerful or less powerful than I realize is just a way that I think I can help ensure that I keep other people's joy in mind so that I can be social in the games that are meant to be social and that I can get properly cutthroat in the pods where we're ready to throw down. I want to end with this post by Murph from the Command Zone, who notes one of the bad habits that Commander players sometimes fall into after they lose a game. Almost instinctively, it feels like now you've got to go tweak that deck because of a poor performance. Except that no, you don't, because losing is fine and expected. Kudos, Murph. I couldn't have said it any better. For folks wanting to see our deck lists and for folks wanting to see my game log for all of 2023, links to both are in the description below. A link to our deck lists is in the description of every video that we do, so check out those show notes if that's what you want to see. And for folks who have been asking about a blank template of my spreadsheet and maybe a tutorial on how to use it, that's actually something that is still in the works, still something that we have to ponder a bit. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be a tease. I just want to be upfront with you. We will let you know where that lands in a future podcast episode. Whew. And with all that, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you have any other questions about all this noise and nonsense, and we will see you at the end of 2024 with even more game data, because yes, I am continuing this project in this new year. So until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.